Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I'm pleased to welcome Jaime Punishill, CMO of Lionbridge, and Talia, co-founder of Globalsake and founder of Yeser. Attendees have the opportunity to place questions into the chat during this session. We will leave 15 minutes at the end of the event for Q&A. Thank you for joining today. We're going to jump right into things. Jaime, you may now begin.
Wow, that was so formal, Becky. Thanks. I feel very official now. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We're excited to welcome Talia, who runs an awesome organization called Globalsake, which I'll let her tell you about. But I think it's important to start with something I've been thinking about a lot. Lionbridge turns 25 this year, and our 25th anniversary. And so we're going to do a lot about that, and you'll hear more about that in the coming weeks. But we've spent a lot of time really thinking about the last 25 years in the localization business, and where it's come and where it's going. And it's why I'm so excited to talk to Talia today, because truthfully, she has been in this industry pretty much as long as there has been in industry. And played just about every role you can conceive of. She's been a translator and a linguist. She's been a buyer, she's been a seller, a consultant, an organizer of creator of organizations like Globalsake and others. And so I want to welcome you, Talia. I'm super excited to talk about that. And perhaps most importantly, she is a former Lion, which for those of you who don't know means that she once upon a time was a member of Lionbridge. So welcome very much. Maybe you could tell folks a little bit about Globalsake before we dive in.
Thank you, Jaime. Thank you, Lionbridge, for having me here today. It's a pleasure. I did start my career in this industry as a localization manager. I started about 25 years ago. So I'm kind of running parallel with Lionbridge's anniversary. But I did start from the content side of the house. I did transcreation of literary, transcreated poetry and off-Broadway shows, and then took that over to the marketing area of creative copy for time evaluation and local content origination and such. But then managed localization at actually Lionbridge was my very first San Francisco job. That's what brought me to the city over 20 years ago, and then worked at a couple of other LSP sides, and then shifted about 13 years ago to the client side into product and growth. So led international product and growth at LinkedIn, at SurveyMonkey, where I headed our global growth, and before that, Google Maps and Earth. So kind of, as you said, very different functional areas of always consistently focusing and optimizing for the international segments. And really my biggest passion has always been understanding people within the cultural context of their regional environment. And so the culture and the regional factors, it's always something that's been, that I've been obsessed with. And later in my career, when I was able to actually A/B test and data proof those concepts, which are very hard to explain to someone who has not traveled or has not lived in other countries, right? Who doesn't speak in different languages. It's the data spoke, so that's when I was able to be more effective in terms of driving product geo-fit.
No, that's great, and we're going to talk about A/B testing in a little bit, and some of those other things. But I want to start with the sort of last 25 years. And we have a nice contrast today. I'm relatively new to this industry. November will be 4 years for me. At Lionbridge and in this industry. I come from other industries before. And so, really learning about this industry and studying its history and just looking at the dynamics of it has been fascinating for me, as a business person from other areas. It's one of the, exciting reasons why I joined Lionbridge. And I think the exciting promise of the industry is this great big dream, right? This vision. How do we remove language and culture as obstacles to global commerce, to global connectivity, to connecting as humans? 25 years later, though, it strikes me we're still relatively far away from realizing that dream of eliminating those barriers. At least from our point of view, I think, it feels like we're at a big turning point, though. And for much of the last 25 years, big changes have been technologically driven in this industry and others. And we're really looking at AI, what we call localization AI or AI powered localization, as just being the game changer, right? And maybe even about to launch us into a new epic. We talk a lot about machine translation in this industry. And while machine translation is AI, it is artificial intelligence. AI is not machine translation. And we can already see AI handling, not just the translation, but source analysis, content tagging, optimization, linguist selection, workflow routing. And that should help us get to a sort of a speed and a scale that we've never seen before, and move into an era that we're calling, sort of where we think we can bring the vision, to life, localize everything. And I'm curious, Talia, as somebody who's lived quite literally from sort of the beginning, of the pivot point of the world from translation to localization, your view of that.
Yeah, well, I think, in some ways the industry has changed a lot, and in some other ways it has not changed at all. So I think the big changes are in mind shift. At the beginning of the inception, people understood translation. They didn't quite understand localization, adaptation, certainly content adaptation, but certainly adapting product experiences and optimizing core funnels by geo, by culture. That was not a concept. I think today we're getting closer to that, although, today, obviously, most companies have an internal localization team, and LTN is understood, but very much from a narrower mindset. I found actually both on the LSP side and the client side, very much seen as a language support. My vision, and really this is what Globalsake is about with corporate education, is to elevate the conversation of localization to a much more strategic, holistic, cross-functional level. It's something that really needs to be, international efforts need to be aligned with the stakeholder leads of every single function and every single code base in the product experience, right, across the org. In terms of AI, I think that, so this is where there has been, shift in AI-enhanced MT, TMS, in, neural networks, and there are conflicts in the industry around whether that's compromises the quality level of the language launches. In my opinion, this is actually, AI enhanced applications is an incredible opportunity and illusion. I'll touch on those two things, but the great opportunity is really the opportunity to scale diverse products for the diverse populations of the world, right? We understand today that people do have different, the ecosystem is different. The problem we're solving for is different in different markets. The ecosystem APIs are going to be completely different. The value props need to be massaged. AI-enhanced neural networks applied to content relevancy, to how we search and how we find things, especially in dense population areas, right? Certainly all the relevancy algos. But also in terms of workflow, localization workflow historically have been very linear. And in some parts of the localization production, we do need that linear process. But mostly, really, we need to change the mindset to a much more circular, not just in terms of SIM-ship, multilingual launches, but also in terms of really thinking global ready from the get-go, really thinking from the inception of product dev design, what it is we're actually optimizing for, what are we solving for, what does that look like in Germany, in Japan, is that the same problem, is that going to be, or is our product going to be discovered, engaged with, converted to in the same way, right? With the new technologies and which enable us a more circular and a more non-linear and more sort of, just as an example, even things like local content origination, right? This is a concept that normally sits with the content strategy teams, right? It doesn't sit usually with the localization team. The localization team are usually, they're getting the end product after the content had been finalized, usually, optimized for US, for English US, and then they need to, adapt it, translate or adapt it, right? But oftentimes you actually need to create completely different content for your addressable segment in a specific market, priority market, right? Where the value prop is different or the messaging should be massaged. And local content origination should be part, again, of that global readiness mindset in the content team, in the marketing team, who are we localizing and marketing for is a big question, right? It cannot be a tail end consideration. It has to be something to consider strategically at the beginning, at the concept stage and milestone progress stages of each functional team across the org, right? And this is where I think the new tooling, the AI enhanced applications can help us scale multilingual, multi-geo launches.
Well, you gave me about 27 different places I'd love to dig in on, but so let me just pick one to start because it's where you started this, because it's a refrain we hear a lot. And again, as an outsider to this industry, it's been super fascinating for me to come in and to see an industry that is unbelievably obsessed with the factory, the actual process of translation or localization. And it reminds me of, that old, almost joke, but aphorism, right? The operation was a success, but the patient died. So yeah, it was a perfect translation and utterly useless from a, market impact or even more interesting to me, there's almost no sense of, and the teams are disconnected. The low teams are disconnected from that impact. And it reminds me too, as I think about the pivot point that we're at, of the story of cellular technology, and it's this debate about quality. And famously, an AT&T engineer, American Telegraph, Telephone and Telegraph, determined, or a series of engineers determined, that the quality of a cellular or a mobile phone call would never achieve the same quality as a landline call, and therefore they should not worry about mobile phones because nobody will ever use them because the quality will never be the same. I don't think I have to tell anybody how the last 40 or 50 years has turned out on that particular observation. And that's why it strikes me in this industry, the view that the technology or the MT or the AI is going to produce inferior quality, while technically could be true, and I'm going to say could, and we'll save that debate for people smarter than me about the AI. It doesn't matter, because if we can go from 10% of the world's content localized, right, which is pretty average for a corporation these days, to 100%, isn't that a better thing, even if it's not perfect?
Well, yes and no, I would say, because it depends on the asset, right? But to touch on your point, with the operation was successful, but the patient died. I see that all the time. It's quite amazing because developers, designers of products, oftentimes they sit in HQ or they sit in a not in the field, right? They're in a lab. They're developing and designing solutions in a lab environment, whereas the end user is in the field, right? What we need to do is to get everyone involved, including the marketeers and the biz dev, strategic partnership folks, and legal for regulatory compliances, but certainly the heart of the product developers, designers, out in the field, wherever our end customers are. If they're just in the US or just in core English markets, that's where they need to go. But if they're in Timbuktu or in Lagos or in Tokyo, right? It's really, you kind of lose touch of who it is you're optimizing for, who it is you're solving for, what do they actually care about when you're designing for them remotely in lab conditions in the field. And this is where, user research, market research plays a huge part. We always kind of made a point of doing field trips, right? Bringing different functional leads from different parts of the org to our in-country to meet, just to live there to work there for a few weeks, and just commute to work, right? Smell, apply all their senses to hear, sense, smell, the environment, the ecosystem where their customers actually live, right? And better understand the ecosystem, better understand, what are the priorities, what do the customers most care about, and certainly the cultural aspects, which are often ignored or at best, understood but not really implemented because they're perceived as not really moving the needle. These are concepts that are very hard to oftentimes evangelize internally for support. When I was able to A/B test those things, those consumer behavior nuance, the expected user behavior in Germany versus in Japan versus in the US versus in Australia, and you look at those elements, element treatments, A/B tested in experiments run by user IP address in country, and tracked through the unique user journey all the way down from discoverability through acquisition, engagement, conversion, retention, right? The downstream impact. That's where you start seeing the impact of cultural customer expected behavior on taking a core action or converting, right? So those are really critical.
But you challenged me on whether content quality had to stay at this level, and whether the trade-off of being able to do the end-to-end journey. Because let's face it, very few companies, and I mean very few. In fact, I'd probably go zero localize the complete end-to-end journey, certainly across their organization. Even the leaders in the industry who do the most, spend the most on localization. In most cases, it's not 1,000% end to end. Some part of that is still, you end up dropping into the, host, the source language, which quite often is English, as we know. And so wouldn't it be better to get to 100%?
Well, to answer, I'll give you an example. So first of all, regarding quality, it really depends on the asset. So for example, UI content, can be a straight translation. Some parts of, let's say the FAQs can be certainly emptied without human post-edit, where you just need to get high volume, also for SEO perspectives, right? For indexing, just to increase the breadcrumbs in the indexed search, XML to the sitemap to the for the search engine to read. But where you do want to double down on focus on quality, certainly on marketing copy, right? On insightful articles, on customer testimonials, on local campaigns that are really tied, how you message the value proposition, how you massage it, and the value proposition that you are focusing on, depending on the local market demographics, on the top sectors, right? Whether you're optimizing for enterprise versus for consumer, right? All these things, you really need to nail them right, especially for marketing assets, right? And creative.
Help me with this. Mm-hmm. They don't get done today. If they're not getting done at all, is it better to do it part way or not at all? Because I don't disagree with you. In a world of unlimited resource, right, of course we would adapt everything and we would do it with all of that nuance, etc. But let's face it, right? I mean, even in the industries that are the furthest ahead, you're talking about 29, 30 languages. That leaves us, about 6,900 short of the total languages in the world, right? We still have an addressable population that is having to operate outside of their native language.
Well, I'll give you a couple of examples. So this is where I was talking about earlier on about the opportunity of AI. It introduces a magnificent, massive opportunity for scaling multilingual products and diverse products for diverse populations. But it also introduces an illusion, right? Which is that we can instantly, even just by deploying English US products, we can instantly reach global audiences instantly, right? In real-time deploys. And that creates an illusion because, yes, we can, but is that the right encounter? First of all, are we if they find us in country, if we're optimizing the discoverability in country, they found us. Can they truly use us? Okay, let's say they're using the English interface, but does search work? Or even if the interface is localized, does search work in their country? Does the right relevancy recommendations apply? Right? Do they have the right local testimonials and things like that? Where I see, the really importance of nailing product geo-fit versus simply the horizontal global applications of straight translation or basic localization language support without geo-fit. Where I see geo-fit critical is in core funnels. So that is in onboarding, top of funnel, onboarding the right people. You don't want to just optimize for signups. It's easy to put a huge sign up button and people click it, but these are, people sign up and never show up, right? These are just empty rage. You want high intent, trusting signups that actually, the measure of growth success is not how many people were acquired, but how many people were retained at the bottom of the funnel, right? And so if the experience is not relevant, if the value proposition is not positioned right, if it's not fully functional for them, right? And if you're not focusing on the brand bond, if they don't love it, yes, they're not going to stick around, not going to have that sticky level. And so onboarding is critical, and where it's also super critical is in the downstream pricing through complete orders. You would be amazed, and I see that every time I've been, I ran thousands of A/B test experiments in different companies, and I always see the same thing. If you look at people, if you compare country level, you look at people viewing a pricing page, which is again a logged out state, and it shows some interest, so some semi high intent users there. And then you follow them step by step, their drop off, step by step from pricing page to checkouts, step 0 all the way to completed orders, to completed transactions. And then you compare that performance in the US, in Australia, Canada, UK, so in other core English markets, and then in late adoption, non-English markets, like Germany, Japan, for example. It's amazing to see. You always see the same thing. I typically see, it depends by company, but I typically see a 20% drop-off in completed transaction in the Canada, Australia versus US, where you would expect them to be on par with benchmark US. And I see typically between 40 to 50%, sometimes even 60% churn drop-off, both voluntary and involuntary churn in completed orders in that funnel in Germany, right? Which really tells you a lot. It says a lot about the actual funnel is not only is it not optimized, it's not built right. And then you start, once you see this data, you understand, you identify some gaps. Companies leave a ton of money on the table simply because they have not adapted the product experience or not used the right language in core funnels. Right, and oftentimes it's not understood, and it cannot be. It's often a blind side simply because it's not tested, or it's not. They just see that and they think, okay, well, we're not. Maybe Germany or Japan is not. Well, maybe we don't have market fit in those countries, right? So they move on to other markets. But really, there is a great opportunity in non-English markets. You simply need to understand your customers there. Understand what they care about, understand what gets them to take the core action and enable those things, right?
So that sounds a lot like focusing on outcomes and performance as opposed to quality.
Right.
Which to me, there's a little tinge of irony because I did ask you about quality. Because I hear, and I'm fascinated by this, like I said, as a marketer, my job is to create outcomes. Right? Did our awareness go up? Do people consume more of our content? Does that content lead them to move through the funnel? Does that lead to leads or engagement? Does that engagement lead to pipeline? Does that pipeline lead to sales? And so everything we do is, in fact, I try to do, I ask our team, how little can we do to get them from A to B. And yet, in this industry, we spend most of our time talking about quality. I have a question, on the back of that, which is, we did a piece a little earlier this year thinking about the future of the industry and hypothesized that a trend we're starting to see a few companies do this to solve this problem, which is we're actually seeing local departments being absorbed by other teams, and in fact, we've seen quite a few marketing teams become responsible for the localization. I'm responsible for the Lionbridge localization. So, we drink our own champagne, so to speak. I work with our own ops teams. We set up our own processes, et cetera, et cetera. And it's precisely because of this, because we're looking to say, okay, where can we have impact? Where does the funnel break? Where do I need to make an investment in the Japanese work that we do or the Korean work that we do, et cetera, because we see a different performance or a different behavior. And I'm curious if you think we'll see more of that from, the localization teams being, cost centers and these separate things that are, somewhat disconnected from the business outcomes and being absorbed into either product teams or user experience teams or marketing teams or other teams that are disciplines that tend to be more outcomes focused.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it really depends on. I mean, the determining factor is the skill set, right? So typically historically, companies have localization teams. They're mostly composed of linguists, right? So they have a linguistic skill set. Their passion, their drive, they suicide on language quality assurance, right? Which is great, but they're focusing on that. This is their skill set. This is what they do. It's important. It's critical. At LinkedIn, we actually measured that in a new low English proficiency market, you can see up to 2x growth after the first year of language launch. However, after that first year, so language launch in low English proficiency in new markets is table stakes, is baseline, foundational. However, after that first year, growth plateaus, right? So we know that that's where you have to double down on product geo-fit, on other things, on local content, on additional things to really nail. And in fact, I would even say, we talked about it in the last Globalsake event last week, large density populated areas, for example, Lagos is becoming in Nigeria is becoming the biggest, the largest city in the world, right? You cannot, the concept of designing for the average users is useless. It's not, that doesn't work, especially in highly dense populations. You need to really laser focus on the use cases, who it is exactly that you're prioritizing, you're optimizing for in country, and it's different by country. Therefore, you need to really have those country level dashboards and signal health tracking on an ongoing basis, which often companies don't. Usually they lump US data and international data. But to answer your question about management of localization, I've seen, that the concept of having a localization team isolated, seen as a production factory house and buried somewhere downstream in the org structure is not helpful, right? I mean, we need to elevate localization to a much more strategic, holistic and cross-functional level within the org. International is an extremely horizontal effort. It's not a vertical. Companies are structured vertically by functions. And this is the big challenge in driving effectively horizontal international efforts. In my role at LinkedIn and at SurveyMonkey, I was not part of the LTN team. I was part of the product growth and led, managed the product-led growth efforts. And I had to align my international OKRs with every single stakeholder leads across the world. Right? That is critical. You need to create a cultural environment within the company to foster that, right? To enable that. That's rare. That was not in the companies I worked at. It's something that I needed to fight for. It's something we needed to establish, right? And this is part of the global ready first mindset in that I always talk about in product, platform, and people, the org structure. This is really, really important to effectively succeed in new markets. In my opinion, it's okay to have. I mean, different functional teams have different skill sets relating to their function, and that's important. The L10N team does not hold, necessarily product or design or marketing or biz dev skills, right? Often there are linguists. However, I tend to advise to create an autonomous international product team. L10N is part of that. INTN is part of that. International CEO is part of that. It's an autonomous, but it's an extremely collaborative team, creating sort of a steering committee across the organization with stakeholder leads attending on a regular basis, once a week, once a month, to align on those international efforts across the org, right? Only aligning OKRs as a thing that is top-down enabled, right? Those are things that are, and also just sharing in all hands, unique international user data and stories to all of the other members of the organization, so that and the data, right, performance data, is really, really important to create those alliances. So I wouldn't say that it's sort of cannibalizing the L10N team. I would say that the L10N teams should not be seen and should not be structured as a production team, and should be positioned as a strategic product or international strategy team, right? With close alignment. For example, like the international product strategy, PRD, the PRD MVP rollout maps. Those are things that need to sit with an international product lead, and not necessarily be in the hands of other PMs who are not necessarily coming from an international orientation, and it's not their job to drive specific growth in a specific country, right? So these are the skill sets we're talking about.
That's a heck of a transformation. What would you say? What percentage of companies do you think actually operate that way? I have this theory. I mentioned this to you a while back. Maybe 25, maybe 50 companies in the whole world who kind of operate with that, to use your language, that global first, right? If it was digital first and mobile first, it's this global first mindset, right? When we sit down, we talk about the product, we think about the strategy, we think about how we're going to organize. It's because we have, up to 7 billion, almost 8 billion now people potentially to buy this. Okay, how do we design our systems, our structure, our product, our outcome, our UX, etc., knowing full well that we're going to build, that. Because, for me, it's, this is like, we say we're going to build a house, but really over time, we like to build a skyscraper. Well, the foundation that supports a single family home does not support a 100-story tower. And so maybe it's 25, maybe it's 50. And for me, it feels like this is part of the transition that we're still going through from the industrial age, where things were linear and factory oriented and tangible, right? It was stuff, it was manuals, it was paper. And it was very geography focused. It was very, had a lot of physicality to it in both the way we bought stuff and produced stuff, into a digital age, which is two-dimensional and flat and global by default. Right? Maybe 25, maybe 50. Am I wrong?
Very little. I haven't counted. I cannot. I don't have the toolkit to count, but it's very, very few. I actually, I think Procter & Gamble, I think Coca-Cola, I think Nike, companies who invest heavily on understanding their local customers within the cultural context of the regional environment, and really do a lot of market user research, and have the budgets to execute on that, certainly do a good job. Those particular companies I mentioned actually are able to flip the 60-40 revenue generation, US versus international, to a 70-30.
And I'm curious, because those examples are companies who are very marketing / sales led, right? That is the corporate culture is very much driven around. It's not product led. It's not manufacturing led. It's not process led. It's a sales and marketing led culture.
Well, this is because those companies have physical goods, not digital goods, right? In the most part, I mean, Nike has digital goods, but I would
and blew away digital sales, through the pandemic. Like they got the
right.
digital store right.
Sure. For sure, right. I mean, even Coca-Cola, for example, just as an example, I was in Tokyo just a minute before the pandemic, and you walk in Tokyo, and there are Tokyo. If you've been there, you know that their vending machine is for soft drinks is very, very common. It's like in every block there's a vending machine, and so now you see Coca-Cola vending machines everywhere, right? So they need to have been there and seen that this is a thing. Just as one small example, to use this discoverability attribution, channel as a channel, right? As an example, right? I mean, these kind of insights require understanding the lay of the land. In contrast, Pinterest, for example, or even Netflix, when they entered Japan, they translated the localized, but it didn't really catch because they didn't have local content, and they are very much based on content consumption, right? And so they had to re-enter years later, having understood the consumers better there and really kind of communicate the way consumers communicate. So Netflix did this huge splash in the Tokyo, in the Shinjuku train station that has 35 million, I believe, people passing through that single station every single day.
It's a big number.
So that is a great attribution channel. It's not a thing here in the US at all. You would not put posters in the train station, right? But they made the digital, offline, online, and of course came back home with the tail behind their feet, right? And then recreated local content, anime, local quality content, and then re-entered the market, and then did a huge marketing splash with that. Similarly with Pinterest, right? They had translated content mostly, but not local content origination in country, and that was the gap, right? And they had to come back home, rework the content strategy, and then launch again and add that mega marketing splash. Again, who it is you're localizing and marketing for is a very big question, which I think sometimes is not asked and missing the point.
No, that's great. Just a reminder for everybody who's watching. We got about 6 minutes left. I will gladly keep asking Talia questions that I've made up. And offering my own perspective. But if you've got some questions, feel free to stick them in the chat, and I will be sure that we address them in the last few minutes here. I want to talk a little bit more while we're seeing if anybody has any more questions on this idea of the shift from linear thinking to circular thinking. You highlighted in there, and one of your examples was sort of the localization team versus the marketing team. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about that. That's a fairly radical rethink on the operating model.
Yeah, I mean, really, if you think about it, sort of, it's quite simple. It's quite basic, right? In one word, for me, if I have to introduce it in one word, what does it mean? Global ready first is adaptive. Right, you just need an adaptive mindset, an adaptive platform infrastructure architecture, software centricity, microservices, everything in CSS and HTML and cloud native networks and so on, so that you can iterate on the front end in real time, deploys the right experience by user geolocation or by user language interface, right? So it's in the back end, in the product experience on the front end, and in the people org structure, right? It's an adaptive mindset, and if you think about it, anything you do, whatever your company is solving for, think about the end user, right? Think about the end goal. right? What are you, where are you driving, even if it's in 10 or 20 years, right? And then work your strategy backward from there. I think a lot of companies are sort of, in the startup seed phase. They just want to launch. They just want to be in market. So the back end, the code is kind of scrappy and quick. It's lean budgets, lean resources, right? It's a lot of trade-offs, and sometimes that is necessary. But where you see the problem with that is that they're quick to market, but then hit a wall and have to go back and refactor code. It's very, very difficult, much, much more costly, and takes so much more time to fix things, right? I mean, Albert Einstein says the best way to solve a problem is to avoid it in the first place, right? And I think that, and again, sometimes you cannot do that. There's always trade-offs, and this is why you need a skill set to drive international efforts, because you need to understand cost-benefit trade-offs. You need to understand launch cycles and dependencies, what should come before another thing, right? It's not just about language quality, as you mentioned earlier. It's not just about the language quality. It certainly, trade-offs are a big part of that equation. But you do need to be thoughtful. You do need to have an informed decision, right? When you make a decision about a trade-off. And you can only do that if you have a bird's view. If you kind of, in the scale of time and space, you're up there, you're not at the bottom here. So you can see you're tied to the corporate core objectives, where we're heading and who we are optimizing for. And you're also fully aligned and connected with the agendas and the priorities of your peer functional leads, right? So that you can be much more effective in driving what it is you're driving, right? So adaptive and bird's view strategy.
Let me just say one thing to that, talk about some future sessions, and then address Jose's question here, and we'll try to do this in 2 minutes. So one of the things that I have been sharing a lot, certainly with peer CMOs and some others, is, because I see this big change even in the marketing, right? It used to be 1, 2, 3 year plans, with big, long campaign cycles, et cetera. And you can't operate in the digital universe and the global universe that way. Too much changing too fast. And certainly the last 18 months has shown us just, a pace of change that's, almost too much for most humans to process and absorb. But one of the things that's been really useful for my team and the way we think about it is to think about everything we do the way GPS operates. Your point of departure is clear. Your point of arrival is clear. And for a long time, I was commuting up to our Waltham office near Boston, and I live in Connecticut. And every week, the way where I left from was the same, and where I arrived was the same. But the journey was totally different. And because you can't predict the journey, you don't know traffic, you don't know weather, time of year, policemen, road construction, all kinds of things. And I think a lot more of our planning has to be, to that point, very adaptive and data driven and highly responsive. And so you got to build those systems that have that flexibility, as Nassim Taleb says, right? Anti-fragile, to handle that. I want to go to Jose's question here on the pandemic change to remote. And I'd love your thoughts on this, but real quick, Lionbridge has got about 6,000 employees across the globe, plus or minus. And, in basically somewhere between 4 and 6 weeks, we were able to have all of those employees move to remote work. We had a few folks who had to go into the office for some very, keep data centers running and a few things like that, and some really extraordinary tales of just incredible, commitment to keeping those things going. But we're an industry by nature that can do a lot of things not in person, and already leverages a lot of freelancers and specialties, and it's a fairly resilient fabric and ecosystem. And so I think, you got to see who in the industry really could do that. We happen to be well positioned with global offices and things like that, and I think a lot of folks were like that. And yeah, some jobs and some functions will go back to the office, but I don't think we ever go back to the world that we saw in 2019. There's going to be a very, very different working model in this industry and many others, at least from where I sit. Talia, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, I would just say that historically, what I'm seeing is that companies who have survived, who have been sustainable and scalable globally, are those who were able to quickly adapt, right? I mean, the world is changing, the lay of the land is changing on us, it's going to keep on changing. This is just the beginning. We sometimes know what's coming, often we don't know what's coming ahead of the curve, but the ability to quickly adapt, right? To first of all understand what it is you're adapting to, right? So to gain the right insights, to be knowledgeable, and then to be able to respond quickly. The classic examples of big, like eBay versus Taobao back in 2004, and many others, right? Is that they were too late in the game, so they had a global standard infra and strategy versus a global ready adaptive infra and strategy, right? And so even when they realized that China has all these many other different regional cultural factors that they need to respond to, they simply could not iterate in real-time deploys fast enough, and their local competitors took them in a knockout, right? And so we need to be. This is why I'm kind of always talking about adaptive strategy, an adaptive mindset, because otherwise there's no way to sustain and scale globally without it. Now, I'll just add that for Globalsake, we've been around since 2017, and but it's always been high focus on physical events, and a lot of focus not only just on the cross-functional content for driving effective international effort and new markets entry adoption, but also the experiences, the relationship building. In 2021, actually, at the end of 2020, we shifted, format to the Parliament, which is all virtual, but we meet on the first Thursday of each month, 12 events in the year, and it's extremely interactive and engaging, even though it is still virtual, and a lot of relationship building that happens offline based on that. So yeah, please join us, and we do have you, Jaime, on board in the next October 7 event.
Well, I was just going to say that, because I know we're a few minutes over, so thank you everybody for sticking with us, because we could go all afternoon about this. It's a rich discussion and a fascinating time. But there is another event we have on October 7th that Globalsake is sponsoring, and I'm looking really forward to that discussion on this idea of global readiness and how companies can think about this people, process, technology shift. And then I noticed as I was on your website earlier today, there's another one in November, maybe November 7th, that looked similar and quite interesting to me as well on this thread. So if this was useful for you, for those of you who were watching and you'd like to continue the discussion, please join us for some of those sessions. I think we'll be able to illuminate some new perspectives and have a rich discussion about where the world's going. With that, I want to thank everybody for joining us. Thank Talia for taking her time and for the rich discussion. I appreciate everybody's time this afternoon. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.